I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Scott Irwin, Ag Economist from the U of I, now joins us in studio to take up this morning's USDA crop production and world agricultural supply and demand estimates. Go through the numbers very quickly for me and what you found of interest to begin with.
The USDA lowered the harvest acreage estimate for corn by about 450,000 acres. I think that was probably well anticipated by the market. The corn yield basically stayed the same. They raised it from 148 to 148.1 bushels for the U.S. I think that was something of a significant surprise based on a lot of the market feedback and data that corn yields were better than expected throughout much of the Corn Belt. And in the end, the net is that they raised ending stocks to 866 million bushels from a much lower figure the previous month. That was largely because of the recent stocks report.
And so when you add those numbers up and you use the implied ending stocks from the grain stocks report, you come up with roughly that 866, 872. But it's the yield number that makes the difference, because we've been hearing, for instance, for quite some time that corn yields across the Corn Belt were probably better than most had thought they might be.
And I think that actually that statement might well be true, but what I think people forgot was you can have corn yields better than expected, but still worse than last year. And I think that basically it appears that farmers were probably overly pessimistic about their yield prospects in, say, August and early September. And so when they went into the fields, the yields turned out to be better than those expectations. But it was still, for example, in Illinois, worse than last year. And that's consistent with what happened to the Illinois corn yield estimate, which actually dropped from 161 bushels an acre to 159. And I think that if you just listen to kind of the market chatter in that stream, you wouldn't have expected that.
Whatever happened today and whatever people might think of the grain stocks number, these are the numbers that we'll be using for the coming year. What does it imply for a producer at this point for corn?
Well, it implies that we will not have the degree of tightness in supply and demand conditions going forward that we thought might exist just a few weeks ago. And that means that price levels will not be quite as attractive as we once thought, and that's certainly been reflected in the price move.
Yeah, and the United States Department of Agriculture has dropped its average cash price for the year for corn, and for soybeans for that matter.
Correct. They've been dropping them roughly 30 to 50 cents recently.
And when you look out for either of those two crops, corn or soybeans, what would your best guess for producers who are thinking about their marketing needs for the year, how they might continue to do that? Many maybe 40, 50, 60, maybe as much as 70% marketed at this point on their corn.
I think that the answer to that is that right now, we're with the price reaction we've seen in the last day, we're getting certainly a bounce off the lows. Basis levels are very tight, and these are still very good marketing opportunities. And there certainly are significant risks in the world economy that, while seemingly abated a bit in recent days, it can turn on a dime. My bias is to not forget to reward the market with a healthy amount of sales at these price levels.
Did you see anything, for instance, in the export figures that reflect the economic problems around the planet?
Absolutely. The USDA dropped both corn and soybean export projections. They're now at, particularly in corn, historically very low levels, certainly reflecting an expectation of weaker economic growth around the world in the upcoming marketing year and recovery of production in other areas.
You know, the WASDE report includes a global outlook for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Those numbers showed you what?
That world corn production is expected to increase almost 250 million bushels more in this report than just a month ago. And at the margin, when you're talking about a U.S. ending stocks estimate someplace, in that neighborhood of 800 or 900 million bushels, that's a fairly significant jump in the total availability of corn around the world.
Can you identify where most of those bushels are coming from? For instance, are they in the Chinese corn crop?
Yes, you saw it's in three places, in China and the Ukraine and the former Soviet Union states combined accounted for all of the increase estimates of corn production.
Over the long run, and now I'm talking a decade, not a year, are your expectations that that increasing number of bushels that's coming out of planted acres in China, in Ukraine, and the former Soviet states will continue to increase and rise as they may or may not be able to implement better farming practices?
Well, China's an interesting case because there's clearly tremendous potential for them to increase the productivity of the acres that are planted to corn. Whether they will make those investments or try to source those imports other places regarding that as a less expensive alternative remains to be seen. I think the one thing we can be certain of is that we will likely see continued production increases for corn outside of the U.S., particularly in the Ukraine and the former Soviet states and in other Central European countries in the next decade. I think we'll see a rise of alternative suppliers to the U.S. in corn, much like we saw in the 70s through the 90s in soybeans in South America.
Finally, come back to the domestic figures from the crop production report, from the WASDE report. Were there anything in those numbers that I didn't ask you about that you found of great interest?
Well, of course, the drop in the soybean yield forecast was a real surprise to most analysts, including myself. I had expected soybean yields based on the reports that we've been receiving to inch up a bit. And in fact, the USDA dropped those about 0.3 of a bushel. There's been a lot of discussion about potential frost damage in the northern growing areas. And in fact, it was rather surprising that, for example, Minnesota's soybean yield was unchanged. South Dakota actually went up a bushel. The big decliner in terms of soybean yields actually turned out to be Illinois, whose yields dropped 2 bushels in this current report. And I think that surprised quite a few people.
Thank you so much for taking the time with us.
My pleasure.
Scott Irwin, Ag Economist from the University of Illinois. I'm U of I Extension's Todd Gleason.